Good evening, everybody. We will get started in just a moment. We have a lot of people expected tonight, so we'll give everybody a moment to get on our webinar tonight. Okay. Good evening, and thank you so much for tuning in with the Hudson Library tonight. We are delighted to have with us New York Times bestselling author Jennifer Chiaverini. She'll be joining us for a conversation tonight about her new book, The Switchboard Soldiers. The library is delighted to have Ms. Chiaverini back. She visited us in 2016 with her book Fates and Traitors, and also in 2020 with Resistance Women. So we are excited to have her back tonight for a conversation about her new book that just came out July 19th, so 2 days ago, Switchboard Soldiers. In her book, Chiaverini tells us one of the great untold stories of World War I, and that is of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, the women in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And of course, as with any of our author programs, if you would like to purchase a copy of Switchboard Soldiers tonight, we have copies available for purchase courtesy of the local bookstore in town, the Learn It All bookshop. And we'll put a link in the chat if you would like to purchase your copy this evening. So allow me to please welcome back author Jennifer Chiaverini. She is the best-selling author of several acclaimed historical novels, including Mrs. Lincoln's Sisters, Resistance Women, and the beloved Elm Creek quilt series. She is a graduate of University of Notre Dame and the University of Chicago. So thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to hear about your new story. And of course, we are excited to hear from your audience as well. I'm sure there are fans out there that have read a lot of your books. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will get to those after our conversation tonight. So Jennifer, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at the Hudson Library and Historical Society, and of course, all my friends at the Learned Owl. I've had the great pleasure to visit both the bookstore and the library in the past. And, you know, with the pandemic, unfortunately, still a problem. I'm really sorry that I can't be there with you in person, but I'm very, very glad that we have the technology so that we can at least meet this way. So until we can all meet together in beautiful Hudson, we'll just meet from around the world and talk over the internet. And I do look forward to hearing your questions. And as Allison told you, this book is very, very new. It just came out on Tuesday. And all of my books are very special to me. But, oh, and at this point, this is my 32nd novel and my 40th book overall, because I've also written some nonfiction books, 7 quilt pattern books, and also a reader's companion guide to the Elm Creek quilt series. So, you know, with 32 books, I can't really pick a favorite, but I can say that this book is very special to me because the amazing women who inspired it have inspired me as well. And I am just so respectful and awestruck by their courage and their daring. And I feel like this book, Switchboard Soldiers, is a tribute to them. And I really hope that they will become better known through this book, and, you know, from readers telling friends about the people that they meet within the pages. So like so many of my books, I discovered the idea for Switchboard Soldiers while I was researching a previous novel and while I was hard at work at a previous novel. And in this case, while I was researching The Women's March, which is a novel about the 1913 suffrage procession, woman's suffrage procession that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1913 on the day before President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Well, while I was researching that book, of course, that involved learning a lot about the suffrage movement. And while I was researching and reading some secondary sources, I was very surprised to learn that later in his administration, the notoriously misogynistic President Woodrow Wilson endorsed and even campaigned for women's suffrage, a cause he had once vehemently opposed. He didn't even like women speaking in public. He didn't like women having opinions unless they just echoed his own. And what this historian noted, almost as an aside, but I was just riveted upon those words, was that one reason for his change of heart was that he had been profoundly impressed by how American women had acquitted themselves during the Great War. And I mean, I did a double take at this. I was like, are we talking about the same Woodrow Wilson who was so opposed to suffrage before? He had resisted many personal appeals, and of course, everything that went on with the grand suffrage procession. Their most determined and eloquent advocates could not sway him. And something had changed his mind. And I wondered, what was it specifically that American women had done during these crucial wartime years to persuade this entrenched anti-suffragist that women deserve the right to vote? Well, that question really piqued my curiosity, but I filed it away. Now, whenever this happens, I don't trust my memory. I do write it down so that I can refer back to my list of ideas later. And so I went back to work on the Women's March, and I, put everything into telling that story. And when I wrapped that up and set it and moved it on to the production process with my publisher, and I was thinking about what to do for my next book, that question still captivated my imagination. What was it that had been able to convince this president of all people to completely change his opinion on the issue of women's capabilities and women's deserving of equal rights? So I thought that, well, there were some things that I had already known that American women were involved in. I was already aware that women had served just with exemplary courage as nurses, and many had served as ambulance drivers. And then I was aware too that there had been a number of volunteers who had worked with the Red Cross over there and who had worked with the Salvation Army, providing so much comfort, even if it was a cup of hot chocolate and one of their famous donuts, providing that sort of comfort to the doughboys overseas. But I wanted to know, what more did they do? And so I learned that a generation before Rosie the Riveter, a figure that we're all familiar with from World War II, a generation before she rightfully gained so much acclaim, and all the women that she represented gained acclaim, there were already women in the United States filling in for all of the departed soldiers in factories. They worked as streetcar conductors. They worked as postal workers. They were letter carriers. So although those women, their stories aren't as told, we focus more on World War II, already women were stepping up and stepping into workplaces from which they had previously been excluded. And at this point, most of them did not even have the right to vote. Depending upon what state you lived in, perhaps your state had granted women the right to vote, but throughout the United States, no, that wasn't going to come until several years later. But of all of these women who served so bravely, what really intrigued me and what I marveled at most were the women who served as telephone operators with the US Army Signal Corps. And how this all began was pretty fascinating. In 1917, of course, the war had already been going on since 1914, but the United States joined the war in 1917. So in spring of 1917, when General Pershing went over, he was the leader of all the American armies. When he went over to France in early spring, he needed to start setting up the infrastructure that he would need to prepare for the United States soldiers to come over and to begin taking the battlefield and fighting alongside the Allies to defeat the Germans. So he went over there, and even as he was over there getting the lay of the land and preparing, back in the United States, there were all kinds of recruitment drives going on. But General Pershing was already over there. And one of the things that he knew right away was he was going to have an effective communication system. And at this point, maybe from World War II movies and newsreels, we have this image of soldiers communicating by radio. Now, radio had already been invented by then, but it was not at all up to the technological levels that it would be in World War II. So and for the golden age of radio didn't take place until the 1920s. So it had been invented, but it wasn't a feasible option for communications. Communications between military headquarters, General Pershing's officers in the field, his counterparts with the commanders and the officers and the other generals in the French army, in the British army, that was mostly done by telephone. And if you've seen the old TV shows or if you've seen the old newsreels, you probably can imagine what that looked like. You had those large exchanges, those large switchboards, and you had women dressed up, usually with their hair bobbed or maybe up in a bun, sitting side by side on tall stools, and they're working manually with these cables. When a call comes in, a light goes off on the board and they insert one end of the jack and then they say number, please. And the caller tells them who they're trying to reach. And then they say one moment or thank you. And then they have to find the corresponding hole, the corresponding jack, and then they have to insert the cable. And then they listen for a while to make sure that the caller has picked up and that everything's going on fine with that call. And then quickly they move on to the next one because by then surely another light has illuminated their switchboard. So this was how telephone calls were conducted, and it needed to be done quickly, efficiently, and accurately if General Pershing was going to be able to conduct the business of war. Now, at this point, the United States had the best technology for telephone calls in the world. And also, we had the best telephone operators. And General Pershing and his officers, they expected the same quality and service when they got over to France, but that is not at all what they found. For one thing, the country had been undergone, some of the country was occupied, and other parts of the country had been enduring bombardments and all of the deprivations and hardship of years of war at this point. In addition to that, there was a problem of antiquated equipment. It was not the cutting edge technology they were used to back in the States. And also there was a different kind of service. In the United States, callers expected and received prompt, courteous, efficient service, but they had a different kind of more casual approach according to the Americans. Now the French, they might have had a very different description of what was going on, but it was more casual. It wasn't just quick, make that call. You had to, chat with the operator a little bit, ask about the weather, talk about how their day was going, and then give them the number. And then, then they'd connect your call. Maybe somebody would pick up, maybe not. If there were too many lines in work, and they needed to make a new connection, they might just arbitrarily yank someone else's cord and drop that call. At least that's how the Americans described it. Again, the French would probably have a very different take on how things were done. They actually thought the Americans were too brisk and they weren't friendly enough. So when General Pershing got over there and found out that he was not going to be able to get the same level of service, he knew that things had to be changed. So first, the American technology came over, and then to fill these switchboards, well, that was when they came into a problem. Because back in the States, this was considered women's work. And remember, we're talking 1917. This was considered women's work. And therefore, nearly all telephone operators in the US were women. Now, higher up in some of the levels of the companies like AT&T and Pacific Bell, well, then, of course, you'd find men working in various positions. And there were indeed some men on switchboards, but it was almost exclusively the purview of women, and often young women. So what they tried to do over there was, okay, well, we've got all these soldiers, we've got all these enlistees and regular army. So the first thing they did is they tried to train male soldiers, which is redundant because all of the soldiers were male, to work these switchboards. And they thought that, okay, we'll train the experienced telegraph operators on this different equipment because they're kind of analogous skills. So they worked on training the men to do the job, and it would take on average the men about a minute to connect each call. Back in the States, an experienced woman telephone operator could connect a call in 10 seconds. And if you're thinking about how these are military orders, military intelligence, vital information, seconds count. Seconds might mean the difference between victory and defeat, between lives saved and lives lost. So those 50 seconds are incredibly precious, and it makes the difference. It might make the difference between an Allied victory or a German victory. And that was not something that he could take any chances with. So General Pershing went to the US Army and said, I need the best telephone operators that you can find, and I need them as quickly as you can get them here. And then the Army had a bit of a problem because at this point, women were not allowed to enlist in the US Army. The United States Navy was actually ahead of the Army in this. They had already begun enlisting women, and they called them yeomen, and then in parentheses, F, just to clarify that these are female yeomen. And then in the vernacular, they started to get the name yeomanettes. You know, you have to add that diminutive on the end just so that we all understand. And so these women, yeomen, took over a lot of clerical work, a lot of office work, things like that on land, so that would free up the men to go to sea and to fight battles and fight on battleships and to serve in that capacity. But the Army had not yet been willing to go that far. But when General Pershing said he needed the best telephone operators in America, well, that meant American women. And so the US Army Signal Corps began recruiting them. And when this recruiting drive was going on, there were certain very important criteria that the applicants had to meet. First of all, of course, they had to be excellent telephone operators, or they had to be able to learn very quickly on the job. A few of them did come through that way, but almost exclusively, they were very experienced, very skilled telephone operators with lots of experience and references to back that up. Secondly, and this is the criterion that left a lot of women out who otherwise would have been thrilled to participate. The telephone operators had to be fluent in both French and English. Maybe not just, took a class in high school. You had to be absolutely fluent in French as well as English. And this was because the American telephone operators would be directly connecting with the French telephone system, and they would be connecting calls between American officers, American soldiers, and their counterparts in the French government and in the French army. And sometimes the two men or more connecting on this call did not speak each other's language. And so it was up to the telephone operator not only to connect that call and make sure that went through, but then to act as a translator on the spot between the American or British and the French officer who could not otherwise talk to one another. So as you can imagine, considering the information that they would have been communicating, every word, every intonation had to be absolutely accurate and absolutely spot on. So that was very important. And then third, these had to be women of absolute, impeccable, unquestionable loyalty to the United States, because they, again, would be dealing with important military secrets. And they also had to be very smart, very sharp. So not only were they loyal to the US, they would not intentionally divulge any important information. They also were clever enough not to do it accidentally. No one was going to trick them into divulging an important secret. They knew when to say, oh, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about, or no, I've never heard of that, or I have no idea when we might be moving closer to the front, if that's even going to happen. So they had to be very, very smart and absolutely trustworthy. So that was a high bar to set. But when the advertisements went out, when the recruiting notices went out, they focused a lot on the industry publications, the magazines like Bell Telephone News and Pactel News, the magazines that were published for people within those companies and all employees at all levels within those companies. And when the call went out, within weeks, the resumes and the applications started coming in. 7,600 women from the US applied for these important jobs, and they knew they were going into a war zone. The advertisements made it clear this would be dangerous, difficult, arduous work, absolutely crucial to the war effort, but definitely with hazards. And yet these women were so eager to go, out of a combination of determination to serve their country, eagerness to have some adventure, curiosity, wanting to seek career advancement. And then a lot of them had very deeply personal reasons for wanting to go and serve. Some of them were recent French or Belgian or other French-speaking immigrants. Others were first generation. And so they had deep personal ties to France and Belgium. And they wanted to do absolutely everything they could to push the Germans out of the occupied territory and regain liberty for the countries that they love so dearly. So out of those nearly 8,000 women who had applied, a few hundred were accepted into the next level, where they were summoned to various regional facilities, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, and New York, where they received additional training and testing of their skills, testing in their French fluency, because that was absolutely crucial. And it did weed out a number of otherwise very highly qualified applicants. And then, of course, there was physical training as well, calisthenics and all of that, military training, just to make sure that they would be prepared and that they were up to the rigors of a difficult ocean crossing and hardships from wherever their postings might be. Now, out of those few hundred who went for the additional training, for the first group, so the first unit, first group, was comprised of 33 women, and they sailed in their uniforms, having sworn their military oaths, prepared and ready as they could be for, the unknown of what was going to come. They sailed first for the UK. They landed in Liverpool, and then they crossed the UK, and then they departed from Southampton and set sail for France. And then after they crossed the Channel and they landed safely, they were dispersed, some to General Pershing's headquarters, some to important bases in headquarters in France, and then others closer, back to the rear, where they were dealing with they were on supply bases and hospital areas and things like that. And then some were placed very close to the front in these more makeshift, less polished switchboard exchanges, where they were very close to the front, not in the trenches, of course. There were male soldiers there who were on the receiving end of the calls they placed, but very close, well within bombardment range. And many of them endured shelling and, the fallout from shrapnel and everything else like that. And so the risk to their lives, wherever they were stationed, was indeed quite likely, quite probable. And I would really like to show you a photograph of some of those women. And I'm going to try to do this. This is my first, I did a practice earlier. Now I want to try seeing what I can do with sharing my screen with you. And I'm going to need to move some things out of the way. And I hope you can see it now. The photograph, and this is my absolute favorite photograph of the switchboard soldiers, of the telephone operators with the US Army Signal Corps. And I just love them. I love how they're standing up so proud and straight in their uniforms. I love the woman in front with her arms crossed. And I just love the dignity and the strength that they're showing, the pride in their work. And every time I see this, I just think of how young they were. They wanted women primarily between 18 and 35. A few younger than that did slip in because sometimes they lied about their ages to get in. You know, there were a few 16 and 17-year-olds who sailed and claiming they were 18 or 19. And then there were a few who were over 35, but it was mostly young women in their 20s, most of them in their early 20s, most of them single, unmarried women, but there were a few married women as well. And so there were so many things that as women in 1917, they were forbidden to do back in the United States, back in their hometowns or their cities. And yet these young, brave women, when they had the opportunity to go into danger, to, support the Allies and help right this terrible wrong, because stories of the terrible things that were being done to civilians, the atrocities in Belgium, the terrible things that were happening to the people in occupied France, they wanted to go and do their part to bring it to an end, to bring a war to as swift an end as possible so that peace would fill Europe once more. And all of the men that they loved, their brothers, their sweethearts, sometimes their husbands, their neighbors and friends would all be able to come home. So of these brave, courageous women, I want to draw your attention to this woman right here, Grace Banker. She was a 25-year-old from New Jersey. She was, and here's another photo of Grace Banker. And she was such a good telephone operator with AT&T headquarters in Manhattan that she had been promoted to the level of instructor with AT&T in New York. And so she was made, at the young age of 25, she was placed in charge of this first group of 33 women who were going to sail for France. And here's the photo that I showed you, the more sepia toned photograph. You can see a nice view of her uniform, and you can see her insignia. And you can see here in this area, I'm indicating that, she has not only, she has a fuller insignia than the other women to mark that she is in a position of authority. She is one of the chief operators in authority over the other young women. And you might also notice that she is wearing a medal for her extraordinarily courageous and exemplary service. She won a medal of, oh gosh, now I'm drawing a blank. She won a very important medal. She was decorated for her service. Now I'm trying to think of it, but it's just slipping my mind, and there's no excuse, and I apologize. But she was highly decorated for her service. There were a number of telephone operators who were also decorated, but she did receive this highest honor. And just when I think of someone so young with so much responsibility and how brilliantly she handled it, I am just overwhelmed and impressed by her, as well as all of the other women who bravely went over there to serve their country. And when they came back to the US, of course, and they did not all return. Some of them gave their lives while they were over in France and Belgium and occupied Germany. But I am incredibly impressed and just very deeply respectful of the sacrifices they made and how they stepped up when their country needed women with their particular skills, and how they broke ground, and they just enough to impress a very, very reluctant president and Congress and American public that women were capable of so much more than they had been given credit for, and that they deserved not only the right to vote, but greater participation in democracy and in the workplace. So, well, that was all that was my introduction to the book, and I would really be happy to answer any questions if there are any questions from any of you listeners, wherever you are,
Yeah,
if you're in
we do
Hudson
have,
or if you're elsewhere.
yeah, we do have some questions coming in. Just out of curiosity, Jennifer, do you have a background in history? Because you can, all your novels are so well researched, you can tell, and they're so richly detailed. Do you have a background in history?
Well, I've always had a deep, profound love for history, especially women's roles in American history. And but my academic background is in I was an English major. I have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in English literature. So that's where I approach it. But I've always been fascinated by history. I love historical fiction, which is why I write it. And I love learning about, I know it's important to learn about the presidents and the generals and all of the important men that are celebrated in American history. Hey, I've written about the presidents and the generals too. But what's always really made me the most curious is the lives of, quote, ordinary people. I want to know about what women were doing, what more marginalized people were like, the people that maybe did not make it into the traditional narrative that we heard about in school, but whose contributions, while often overlooked and not given due credit, were just as essential to the development of America and American history as everyone else's. I've always wondered about them, the people who didn't make it. Maybe they made it into the footnotes, maybe they made it into the margins, if they made it into the story at all. So those have always been some of the people that really fascinated me, the people who did the tough jobs, did the essential work, made the fascinating discoveries, but very often didn't get the credit for it. And so those are the people that I focused on in a lot of my storytelling, because I figure, well, if it fascinates me, I bet it will fascinate other people as well, people who are curious about the same kind of things that I am. And so that's why I love making those kind of subjects the subject of my novels.
Just curious, so when you're doing your writing process, do you do your research first, or is it kind of you write and you research at the same time?
Well, I've already kind of described how I get the ideas from my books. And then when I'm ready to start with that new idea that fascinates me, I usually do some background reading just to get a good sense of the history. And if I know which particular, and this is where I discover whom I should focus on. If I know that already going into it, well, then I do a lot of biographical research into that historical figure or figures. But often I discover who I should focus on as I am doing that general background research. And as I do that background research, then I discover what narrow topics I need to focus on, whether that's a historical figure or a particular setting or an important historical event. And then as I'm taking notes, I construct a timeline so that I have a very good sense of the historical flow. What were the actual order of things that happened, just so that I know I have a framework to work from. And then after I feel like I have a good sense of that and I'm prepared to move on, then I work from my timeline and I try to just study it and see where are some natural logical breaks in the action that would make good chapter demarcations. So then I construct an outline, but it's not the traditional outline that we learn in school. I use that traditional format if I'm writing nonfiction, but when I say outline for a novel, what it really means is I say like chapter 1, and then I give the date or dates for that chapter. And then I write a paragraph or make a list of what things need to happen in that chapter, what character development, and then what, what plot development needs to happen in that chapter. And then I move on from there, following my outline, just to, see what makes the most sense. Where is there a logical pause and that sort of thing? What events are logically grouped together or not? And then when I have that done and I'm satisfied with it and I've revised it and gone back and looked at it, when I'm satisfied with that rough outline, then I begin writing the book. And at that point, I do often discover, oh, wait, I actually need to know more about this particular topic or this particular person. And so then I will delve back into research. And that might take 5 minutes if it's, okay, what train station would she have visited? It might take a few days. And then all of that research might be a paragraph in the book. But it's important to get it right. And sometimes as I'm writing, not only do I do additional research, but then I also very often, I would say always, end up revising the outline, because sometimes something that is a sentence in my outline actually ends up being pages and pages of actual narrative. And then I have to rework my outlines to achieve a better balance between the different chapters. So I do a lot of my research reading up front, but then as I am writing, I always conduct additional research to discover what I didn't know that I didn't know. But now I know that I don't know and I need to know it. So research goes on the whole time.
Okay, well, so we have a lot of questions from our audience. I'll take the first one here. Is from Carol, and she said, while I have enjoyed all of your later books, I admit that I missed the Elm Creek quilt series. Will there be any books that follow the format again?
I'm not sure. Follow the format? Do you mean like being a story in the series? Well, she probably can't answer. I'm just going to assume that's what you mean. I'm assuming what you're asking is, are there going to be any more Elm Creek Quilts novels? And I will have another one out, but remember, I start writing them about 2 years before you see them on your library shelves or on your bookstore shelves. So I am in the very early stages of writing a new Elm Creek Quilts novel. Of course, I have had set that aside to do, book touring events for Switchboard Soldiers. So there is one right now planned for 2024. And I know it seems like, oh, that's such a long wait. Not for me. I got to get working. It's going to be here before I know it. But I do have another book coming out next year that I hope you will look for and I hope you will enjoy. It's already in the editing process. And that book is called Canary Girls. And it's also set in the UK. It's inspired by historical figures, by women that I learned about while writing Switchboard Soldiers. See, I'm going back to how I get my ideas from my books again. And this book is about the women munitionettes who worked in the munitions factories, in the arsenals, making the bombs and the airplanes and the bullets and all of the other weapons of war that were needed, excuse me, when Great Britain went to war in 1914. And the title Canary Girls comes from a particular group of women of these munitionettes that I focus on. These were the women who worked with TNT, filling shells or, doing all of the work of putting those bombs and shells together, because what they only gradually learned through the course of the war was that not only was TNT dangerously explosive, it was also highly toxic. And in addition to the terrible health effects that the women suffered over time working with this material, it also turned their skin a vivid yellow hue. And so they were very recognizable as munitionettes who worked in the danger buildings or in the danger rooms. And the nickname that they acquired was Canary Girls. But, in addition to the difficult work and the hard work, they also discovered a lot of independence. They were earning great wages for the first time in their lives, most of them. They were acquiring new independence and camaraderie and the pride of serving their country. As many of them said, even as they were falling very seriously ill, the lads risked their lives in the trenches. We risk our lives in the arsenals. So they very much saw this as their service to king and country. And they also had a lot of fun on the football pitch as well. So I write about that too. So Canary Girls will be coming out next summer, and then probably a year after that, assuming I can get it written, I'm still in the very early stages, but assuming all goes well, the next Elm Creek Quilts novel will be out in 2024. Yes, I had to remember what year it was for a moment. So.
Well, we certainly look forward to that. That sounds like a fascinating book. A couple of our audience members mentioned that the medal is called the Distinguished Service Medal.
Thank you. See, you could probably tell I'm sleep deprived and getting a little hoarse from everything going on. So thank you for helping out my poor tired brain. I appreciate it.
Kristen asked, and I know you did mention this at some point, I've read that Congress did not recognize the ladies for the important role that they played. Has this since been corrected?
Well, this is not a spoiler, because I talk about this in the author's note, but not in the novel itself. So we can talk about this even though it happens afterward. Even though the women were told that they were in the army, even though they were told, they swore military oaths, they wore uniforms, they saluted officers and were saluted. They were subject to all military regulations. They were not free to just quit their jobs if they had a bad day. They were there for the duration, and they never signed any employment contracts. When the women came home, when the telephone operators came home to resume their civilian lives, many of them wanted to apply for veterans benefits. They wanted to join their VFW posts. They wanted to march in Memorial Day parades and 4th of July parades with the other men who had served from their hometowns. And when they applied for these various things, they were told, absolutely, we need to see your discharge papers. So they wrote to the Department of War, they wrote to the Department of Defense and to obtain their discharge papers. And it was at this point that these women learned that, oh no, you were never actually in the army. Women are not permitted to serve as soldiers in the army. You were contracted civilian employees. So, sorry for the misunderstanding, but you are not entitled to any of these privileges or any of these benefits. Well, just try to imagine being the young women that you saw from that photo, who had risked their lives, had made incredible sacrifices to go and serve your country. And you believe yourself to be breaking ground for women and young girls who are looking up to you and admiring you. And you think that you have just, you've done important, crucial work, and you can take pride in that. But now to be told that you weren't actually in the army after all. Well, so devastating, how devastating that must have been. And, a lot of them did not just take that lying down. They started up another battle, that one war was over and another one on the home front had begun. And to their credit, a lot of the men that they had served with, a lot of their colleagues and the men that had been their supervisors, the superior officers over in France and Belgium and occupied Germany, they were equally outraged. So for years, a small group on behalf of all of them fought to get the United States government to give them the recognition that was due to them, and to give them the benefits that as veterans they believed that they had earned. It was not until 1977 that President Jimmy Carter finally signed all the legislation and all the everything that recognized them as veterans at last. They were able to get VA benefits, they were able to wear victory medals, and so many other benefits that were due to them. And of course, as you probably can have well guessed already, by 1977, time had taken its toll, and there were only around 50 of the telephone operators remaining to enjoy this victory. And I'm very sad to say that Grace Banker was not one of them. She had passed on by then. But for those who were there, it was really a wonderful achievement and a wonderful victory. Now, there is still some legislation pending even now, awaiting. I think they need just a few more senators to back it in order for them to get even greater recognition than what they were given in 1977. And, we're hopeful that, a few more will come on board and make that happen. It's called the Hello Girls. So if you want to look that up, it's like the Hello Girls legislation. That was actually a name that was given to all telephone operators, not just those who served in the military. It was just a catch-all phrase for any telephone operator. My research, I found in newspapers, the first mention of telephone operators called Hello Girls was in 1889. It probably happened before then, but this was the first documented source I was able to locate in United States newspapers. And the latest mention of that nickname I found was in 1973. So, that encompasses many, many more telephone operators than the ones to whom this legislation actually applies. So that's why I mostly call them switchboard soldiers, not hello girls, because while all switchboard soldiers could be called hello girls, not all hello girls were U.S. Army Corps Signal Corps telephone operators.
Patricia asked, so I know in your book, you focused on one true character, which was Grace Banker, and the others were fictional.
Yes.
But she wanted to know if it's known of the other women's names, and
yes.
if there are other books or other things written about them.
I would encourage you to look at the acknowledge page of my book, of Switchboard Soldiers. As with all of my historical fiction, I mention all of the sources that helped me, all of the historical works and primary sources that I drew upon. And I was able to obtain the names of all of the women in the different groups. This is the photo I showed you was of a few women from the first group, but there were several groups who deployed, within a few weeks of each other or a few months of each other. There was one group that was on the ship in New York, ready to sail for Europe when the armistice came. So they never actually got to go over there, and they were glad to have peace, but disappointed that they didn't get to go over and do their bit. A great source for a lot of my historical novels, this might come as a surprise, was actually Ancestry.com, because there are great, and you might, if you are into if you're a genealogist, amateur or otherwise, you already know that Ancestry.com has great resources for immigration, for when you're, the people from the old country. In my case, it was France, Germany and Scotland and the UK, and that's where a lot of my ancestors come from. And you can see what ships they came on, and when they came and who they traveled with. Well, there were also the same kind of ship records for soldiers going back and forth, and they are listed right there, all of their names, which groups they were in, what their ranks were, when they sailed, what the ship was, where they sailed from it. So all of that I was able to find in wonderful digitized records right on Ancestry.com. So that was pretty fantastic to be able to get that. I'm sure the same information is available in the National Archives as well, but for me, it was incredibly convenient to just go to ancestry.com on my computer and find where they were and what men, what units and battalions and regiments of men they were sailing with. And so that's how I was able to know that the second group was with all of these engineers and things like that, which also comes into play in my novel. So, sometimes I'll find a source that says, so-and-so, a particular operator sailed at this time. And then I'll look on the manifest and I'll see, no, they didn't. It's right here in the official documentation. So that's one of the problems, one of the challenges of writing historical fiction is that sometimes sources disagree. And you have to use a lot of educated guesswork to figure out which is probably the most accurate. But that's one of the advantages of writing historical fiction, is that I am allowed to make stuff up. In fact, it is required. It's in the job description to make things up. So if I can't figure out which of these two equally trustworthy sources is correct, I can just pick the one that goes best with the story I'm trying to tell. Fortunately, most of the time they agree with one another, but not always.
One question we had from Jill, how many years were the women in Europe? And then she also wanted to know, were any of them actual casualties of the war?
Well, I'm not sure how you would define casualties of the war. I would say if you died while you were serving your country in uniform, because you were there, whether you died because of disease or because of an accident, I would say you died in service to your country. Because if it was for me, others would define it differently, I'm sure. You don't have to be on the front line to die in service of your country. All of the soldiers who succumbed to illness while they were serving at a supply depot, they are serving their country and they made that ultimate sacrifice just as someone who was in the trenches. That's how I look at it. So any of these telephone operators who lost their lives over there died in service of their country, because they would not have been there except that they had signed up and had willingly accepted all the risks to their lives. And I believe there's another part to that question. Was there?
She asked if there were any known, if any of the women had died.
Yes, not all of these telephone operators returned home alive. And I'm not going to tell you whom, because that is definitely a spoiler. And I don't want to ruin the novel for anyone who hasn't read it yet. It's only been out a few days. So I have to assume that most of you here have not read it yet, unless you devoured it right away, in which case, oh, I love you. Thank you. But I don't want to spoil anything for anybody else who wants to discover that as they're reading the novel. But I will say that not all of them returned home. Most of them did, but not all of them did.
Well, we'll wrap up here. We have just one final question. Jennifer, why do you think these stories are so important to share with future generations? So looking at technology and how much has changed over 100 years. And I'm sure if we have any younger people listening today that have always grown up with cell phones and things like that,
right.
The whole idea of the switchboard is such a foreign thing. Why do you think it's important that the future generations learn about these stories?
Well, I think first of all, we have to give young people credit for caring a lot more about history than I think they're always given credit for. I know that both of my sons are fascinated with history. My youngest son, especially, he's a music major, but he also wants to see if there's some way he can also double major in history. And I said, well, talk to your counselor, honey, but I don't know how he can take on more, but he loves history that much. And I think, I see a lot of younger people who really, really enjoy historical fiction. But I think it's so important to learn about the roles that, especially for women readers, but really for everybody, to learn about how women contributed And, we could talk for a long time about why they weren't always giving credit. But I think it's important for us to study women's roles in history so that we can see and appreciate how far we have come and how it is now our responsibility to carry us even further forward into the future, just as generations of women did for us before we came along. Now it is our time to move things forward, and certainly to make sure we don't travel backward. But in honor of them and what they did, it's important for us to continue. So for the next generation and the one after that, we have moved us forward so that we will eventually get to true equality. And it's going to happen as long as we all participate. I also think it's important for us to study difficult times in the past, because it gives us hope for the future. Because if we can look back at how other people very much like us, but in very different circumstances, how they faced incredible dangers and hardship and challenges, and they either alone or very more often by joining together and working in unison and working in harmony toward a goal, how they were able to overcome incredible challenges and overcome incredible obstacles. And I think today we can look back and, we can look around now, we're still in a pandemic. We're facing incredible challenges to our democracy, dangers to our environment. And sometimes, yes, these challenges look daunting. But I think if we can look back at what people accomplished 100 years or 50 years or even 10 years before us, we can say they faced great challenges then. We face great challenges now. They were able to find a way, and we too can find a way to overcome the challenges that we face in our time. Those were the challenges that they faced. These are the challenges of our generations. And we can take heart from what other people did before us to know that we are capable of more than we might realize in the moment if we just summon up all of our courage and strength and work with other people and do what needs to be done, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate you joining us, and of course, hearing about your new book, Switchboard Soldiers. Again, if you would like to purchase a copy, we have a link in the chat of Switchboard Soldiers from the Learned Owl Bookshop. And Jennifer, thank you so much for your time, and our patrons, thank you, of course, for your interest in our program. And on behalf of the Hudson Library, we are so pleased to have you back.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope that we're all back together. I love Hudson. It's such a beautiful, beautiful town.
Yeah,
and I
maybe
hope to come back sometime.
Maybe when your next book comes out, you'll be able to come in person and see us.
Let's hope so.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. And
Bye-bye.
thank you, everyone. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everybody.
You're welcome. Good night.
Good night.